The Oracl3 Network.
You Didn't Let Me Finish is a weekly true crime podcast with a difference, co-hosted by
me, former BBC News crime correspondent and author Ben Ando.
And me, journalist Victoria Mitzi.
Frenemies Victoria and I saw lockdown as an excuse to exploit our at times grim specialism and have, due to popular demand, continued on all the big platforms where you usually get your podcasts.
Oh, and free murder tips included. Catch us on Twitter at YDLMF Podcast. New episodes every Tuesday night.
Now, back to the show.
Hey, Rainbow Warriors. This is my disclaimer. Beyond the Rainbow is a true crime podcast. It's not suitable for young children, and maybe not even for some adults. I tend to swear like a sailor, and I'm kind of proud of that. Listener discretion is advised. Hey there, Rainbow Warriors, and welcome to Beyond the Rainbow, True Crimes of the LGBT. I'm your host, CJ. Hey, I just want to remind everyone, coming up this Sunday, May 16th, is a special event. It's called Drag Me to Hell. It's a special spooky time drag show featuring some awesome drag queens and some stories by true crime podcasters. This event is being put on by my friends at Murder News and Aura Van Dank. For those of you that don't know Aura, she actually is also a podcaster and has a show called Murder's a Drag. She's also a very beautiful drag queen. You can find tickets available at eventbrite.com, and it's only $5 to join this event. So that's May 16th, it's Sunday, and go to eventbrite.com, type in Drag Me to Hell. There you'll also be able to find the time the show is airing in your time zone. I hope to see you there, Rainbow Warriors. Find me on the socials, but I know you all know where, so I'll leave that part out. But I will ask you to please go check out my website at beyondtherainbowpodcast.com. Once you're at the website, you can email me with any case suggestions you might have. And if you would like to help support the show, I have a link to my TeePublic merch store and a link to buy me a coffee. Anything I earn from either of those links will go towards purchasing new podcast equipment. Currently, I'm saving up for a new microphone, so hopefully I can get some better sound quality. Also on my website is my expansive list of missing but not forgotten LGBTQ people. This episode's missing but not forgotten LGBTQ person is Leonard Taku. Leonard is a gay New Zealander. He was visiting Tampa Bay, Florida during Christmas time in 2006. Leonard was on holiday from his teaching job at the Marlowe Academy in the UK. He formerly had taught at a middle school in North Carolina. So while he was here visiting in the States, he had plans to go see his friends up in North Carolina, but Leonard was never able to make that happen. He was last seen renting a car at the Tampa Bay airport. The car was a sleek, black Chrysler convertible Crossfire. The next day, Leonard's credit card was used at the Gap clothing store for $46.55. His family believes that it probably was Leonard that made that charge, because Leonard loved Gap clothing stores. And then on December 28th, somebody did check Leonard's email. Leonard's credit card wasn't hit again until mid-January 2007. And that was when a room at a luxury hotel was being charged in Orlando, Florida. Leonard's family said that charge didn't sound like Leonard at all. He'd much rather stay somewhere cheap, like a hostel or a cheap lodge. They said Leonard wouldn't stay somewhere so extravagant. On February 9, 2007, Leonard's rental car was found abandoned at the Ocala National Forest. It was near Little Lake George Wilderness area. The Department of Agriculture happened to be doing controlled burns the day the car was found. The car wasn't damaged at all, but the area surrounding it was burnt to a crisp. So if there was any evidence around the car, it would have been destroyed. Leonard was supposed to return back to England for work on January 3rd. When he didn't show, his family reported him missing. Leonard is between 5'8" and 6'1". He weighs between 160 and 200 pounds. He was 44 when he disappeared, and if he were found alive today, he'd be 59. He has black hair, brown eyes, and he's a Maori, which is an indigenous person from New Zealand. He has the following tattoos, and there's quite a few. A checkerboard pattern in circles on his upper right arm, a series of solid triangles with lines from elbow to wrist also on his right arm, a zigzag pattern from elbow to wrist on his left arm, a tribal design with swirling patterns on his legs from knee to thigh, a Celtic design on his lower back, and Gothic lettering on his upper back. His hair was shaved at the time of his disappearance. The circumstances when he disappeared are pretty shady at best. I know it's been 15 years since Leonard disappeared, but should any of this have jogged a memory of seeing him, please call the Altamani Springs Police Department at area code 407-571-8276. I was sitting on the couch the other day and I was trying to remember the decade of the 90s. A few things came to my mind. I came out in 1992. I'd met a lesbian I was head over heels for, and she wanted nothing to do with me. That is, until I started dating someone else. Eventually, I did get together with the one I was head over heels for, and she moved in with me. In 1994, I'd been out and in a relation for about 2 years. Then I found out that my partner had been cheating on me, so I tried to off myself. After that experience, I realized no one, absolutely no one, is worth taking your life over. I ended up staying with this woman for another 16 years, and not all of it was horrible. In 1998, our daughter was born, and I have to say that was probably the highlight of that whole relationship for me. Also in the 90s, my mom, dad, and brother were all still alive, and that was absolutely awesome. Other than that, I didn't remember too much that happened in the 90s. So I went to the Google Meister to see what I could find. The early 90s had George W. Bush presiding over the United States. And I have to admit it, he is the only Republican president I actually kind of liked. He declared the first official ban on racial profiling. He extended federal pension benefits to include same-sex couples. And even though he's a good old boy from Texas, he admitted to People magazine just recently he didn't vote for Trump or Biden in the last election. He wrote in Condoleezza Rice's name, a black woman, Democrat, and I just love that. Madonna made pointy bras a thing. Body glitter was popular. And if you ask my daughter, she'd tell you it still is. O.J. Simpson tried to do a slow run from the police on a California highway in his white Ford Bronco. Lisa Marie Presley married Michael Jackson. The Tonya Harding skating camp beat the shit out of Nancy Kerrigan's knee. Ring pops were the candy of choice. And all the cool kids were playing on their handheld device called the Game Boy Color. The end of the 90s brought about the fear that the world and all technology as we knew it would end. This was called Y2K. I do have a spoiler alert. It never happened. For one state in the U.S., the 90s brought a murderous trail to gay men. Texas is the Caddo Native American tribe term for friend. Well, kind of. There was a similar word that Spanish settlers put their own spin on, and in the end the word became Texas. And I just want everyone to know that I'm not trying to pick on Texas in this episode, but the 90s sure was deadly for many gay men in that state. In fact, there were so many cases, I'm only going to do the first half of the decade, and there'll be some that I leave off just because of lack of information. The victims still need their stories told, but finding information for their stories was damn near impossible. Before I begin with Texas's Years of Tears, I'm going to recap real quickly a murder that happened in 1991. It's the case of the gay banker Paul Broussard. And the reason I'm just going to give you a quick recap is because I already did this episode. Season 3, episode 14, if you want more detail on it or you need a refresher. Basically what happened, Paul was leaving a gay bar with a couple of friends one night in Houston, Texas. At the same time Paul and his friends were leaving, a group of teenage boys from another area in Texas had drove down to Houston because they wanted to do gay bashing. And they came prepared. They had knife, baseball bats. They even had a wooden plank with nails sticking out of it. So when Paul and his friends came out of the bar, these boys found them and they started chasing him. Paul's two friends were able to escape, but Paul got caught in a dead end. The teenage boys essentially beat the shit out of Paul. When the police and EMT finally arrived, they took Paul to the hospital. When he got to the hospital, he was made to lay on a gurney for over an hour. No doctor wanted to touch him because they knew he was gay and they were afraid he had AIDS and would contaminate them. And Paul ended up dying. Okay, there's the recap. Now for the rest of the early 90s. The very first day of the new decade, January 1st, 1990, a Marine, Private Niccolo Giangrasso, he picked up a 38-year-old gay man named Charles Resendez. This happened in San Antonio, Texas. Niccolo went to a hotel room with Charles where he robbed him of $40 and he killed him just by beating him to death. Niccolo told the police he did it because Charles was some type of faggot. Hold the phone. You pick up a man and you go to a hotel room with him. Did you think you were going there to just watch the free HBO movies? Honestly. So Niccolo was arrested, charged, sentenced, and over a year later while he was incarcerated, Niccolo changed his story. He said that he was sexually assaulted by Charles. A judge accepted Niccolo's plea and let him out of prison. So Niccolo was allowed to go back home to his home state of New Jersey, and then he ended up getting himself into more trouble with the law within 6 months of his release. Niccolo again was put on trial for multiple assault charges. What's with the judge? Why would any judge do that? Oh, okay, you withheld evidence a year ago, and now you're saying this gay man sexually assaulted you. That must be the truth. So, hey, why don't you just leave prison? That's just bullshit. And not a great way to start the decade out for the LGBTQ in Texas, y'all. In April of 1990, a 30-year-old John William Zentner Jr., who was called Johnny Bill by those closest to him, was working a Subway sandwich shop in Arlington, Texas. John was a gay man whose family and friends were extremely supportive of him. The night of April 6th, John just happened to be working alone in the shop that night. In walks a 22-year-old man named Dale Wayne Sigler. Now, if Dale's name might sound familiar to you, his story is featured on the Netflix true crime docuseries, I Am a Killer. Dale entered that Subway sandwich shop with a gun in his hand. John tried to run to the back of the room, but he was pumped with 6 bullets, 2 into the back of his head and 4 into his back. Dale ended up stealing $400 out of the cash register, and he fled the scene, leaving a dead John laying face down in a pool of his own blood. 6 days later, Dale turned himself in for the robbery and for the murder of John. It turned out that Dale was acquainted with John, and Dale didn't like John because John was gay. At Dale's trial, he was found guilty of first-degree premeditated murder, and he was sentenced to death. Years later, a new judge looked at his case, and the death sentence was overturned to a life sentence. After 30 years, Dale was paroled. He now walks among us, and he's a self-proclaimed changed man. Aside from the Paul Broussard case that I mentioned earlier, 1991 held tragedy for the gay couple of 29-year-old Tan Nguyen and 35-year-old Hugh Calloway. The couple had just left a gay bar in Dallas, Texas on October 21st. After they left, they were hungry, so they went to McDonald's and got a to-go order. They figured on their walk home that they would stop at Reverchon Park, find a picnic table, and eat. It was about 2:30 a.m. Reverchon Park is a pretty well-known park for gay pickups. On their way to a stone picnic table, the couple passed 3 young black men hanging out in the park. 22-year-old Frederick Kirby, 23-year-old Freddie Thornton, and 20-year-old Corey Burley. After the couple passed the men, they found a table to sit at, and they started to unwrap their food. As they were doing this, the 3 young black men approached the couple. One of the guys, Corey, he had a gun held on Tan and Hugh. The 3 young men started to beat up Tan and Hugh. And while they were doing this, the 3 young men were also eating Hugh and Tan's food. I guess that gay bashing is awfully hard work. Need to fortify, fuckers. At least 3 other gay men who were out cruising the park that night for a hookup had walked by the bashing. But they were scared and they ran off because they were being threatened by the 3 young men. During the beatings, the assailants were yelling gay slurs at the couple and Asian slurs at Tan. The beating lasted probably almost half an hour. The young men forced the couple by gunpoint to a retaining wall in the park. They ordered Tan and Hugh to drop their pants. And since Corey Burley was holding a gun on him the whole time, the couple did as they were told. Freddie Thornton yelled at Corey to shoot the faggots. Corey fired first at Tan. The bullet hit him in his abdomen and it sprayed blood onto Hugh. A second bullet grazed Hugh's cheek, and a third hit Hugh in his thigh, shattered his femur bone. Tan was able to stand up and run, and he got 50 yards before he fell. Once Tan started to run, the 3 young men chased after him until he dropped. Then they grabbed him and they pulled him into some brush, and they started to beat and kick him more. Finally, the assailants left. Hugh tried to stand up so he could get to Tan, but his leg collapsed and he fell again. Hugh could hear Tan call his name, but he couldn't get to him. Almost another half an hour had passed before somebody finally found Hugh. Emergency services was called and Hugh was rushed to the hospital. Once he was stabilized at the hospital, he learned the news that his boyfriend Tan had been murdered. Before the 3 assailants left Tan and Hugh, they made sure that they robbed them and they took their wallets and any jewelry they might have. Days later, the gunman, Corey Burley, he tried to sell a gold chain he swiped from Tan to a pawn shop owner in Dallas, but the pawn shop owner had had an alert from Crime Stoppers. He called when he was examining the necklace and realized that the necklace belonged to the murder victim. Corey was arrested and soon so were his cohorts. Corey said he and his friends purposely targeted gay men. They were easy and weak, and you can make them remove their clothing, snatch their stuff, and the gay men were too humiliated to report it. Corey said he did it because he got off seeing the fear in a gay man's eyes. Corey Burley was sentenced to a life term, but he's eligible for parole in 2024. His buddies have long since been paroled. 1992 seemed to be a little bit quieter for attacks on gay men, and I'm not by any way saying that there weren't any. There were, but the information was very limited. So I'm going to jump ahead to 1993. In Midland, Texas. Real quick, I have something about Midland. I've stayed the night in Midland, Texas before when I was just passing through on my way back to California. I certainly don't mean to offend anyone who might be from there or currently live there, but I have to say Midland seemed a bit like an armpit. It was definitely scary after dark. I might have just stayed in a sketchy part of Midland. I don't know, but I did have to walk my dog at dark, and it was pretty scary. Anyhow, Tommy Music was a 48-year-old hairdresser in Midland. He lived with his 40-year-old partner of 20 years named Jerry Hahn. One rainy April evening, Tommy was headed home from work. He was supposed to stop and pick up his neighbor, a teenage boy named Scott Thomas, as well as Scott's friend, another teenage boy named Ramsey Harrell. Tommy drove to the spot he was supposed to pick the boys up from. He pulled over and he let the boys in. Tommy was friendly with Scott's family, so he didn't mind giving Scott and his friend a ride home. Scott would even come over to Tommy and Jerry's and use their swimming pool on hot summer days. Scott hopped into the front seat of Tommy's car and Ramsey jumped into the back seat. At some point on the way home, most likely at some stop, Ramsey pulled out a .22 caliber pistol and he shot Tommy in the back of the head, killing him instantly. The boys then drove the car to an isolated area where they dumped Tommy's body. Then they took Tommy's car and dropped that at the city airport. Somehow the two boys made it back to Tommy's house. And once they were there, they told Jerry that Tommy never showed up to give them a ride. Not long later, Tommy's body was found. So was his car. And after the police had a conversation with Jerry, Scott and Ramsey were arrested. Scott and Ramsey claimed that Tommy had made unwanted sexual advances towards Scott in the front seat, and this gave Ramsey severe anxiety and fear. It made him shoot and kill Tommy. And guess what, warriors? There's your gay panic defense. During the court trial, Tommy Music, who was just a good guy, a kind and caring person who did nice things, like giving the neighbor kid and his friend a ride home, had his whole damn reputation raked over the coals. A thong swimsuit Tommy owned was entered into the court as evidence. For what? It had to be to tarnish his name because he was gay. And since Tommy wore a swimsuit like this in the privacy of his own fucking backyard, he must be a pedophile, I guess. The swimsuit had nothing to do with his murder. Tommy's partner Jerry was called Tommy's housewife by the defense attorneys. It was also made known during the trial that Tommy was living with HIV. It didn't matter to anyone in that damn courtroom. Aside from Jerry, Tommy was murdered in cold blood. A deceased Tommy and his being gay was on trial, not the killer. And surprisingly, with this whole sham court case that was going on, Ramsey Blake Harrell, the trigger man, was convicted of murder. It wasn't the first-degree murder like he was initially charged with. It was more like a second-degree, oopsie, sorry about it type murder. He received a minimum of 12 years with the possibility of parole after 2 years served. I'm fucking surprised that the courtroom and the judge didn't award the boy a trophy and throw him a pizza party, really. Scott Michael Thomas, the neighbor boy who was initially charged with first-degree murder, he wasn't the actual shooter. And Scott later admitted he lied to police and Tommy had never, ever made any sexual advances towards him. Scott Michael Thomas. It's a pretty generic name. All of my search efforts to find what he was sentenced to was fruitless. But since he didn't pull the trigger, I can't see his sentence being any longer or stronger than his buddy Ramsey's. It was a very cold evening, November 30th, 1993 in Tyler, Texas. Tyler's not a huge city, but it's not a tiny town either. Today, the population is almost 110,000 people. Back in 93, it was about 80,000 people. Tyler's located in eastern Texas. It's located between Shreveport, Louisiana, and Dallas, Texas. And I only know that because every 3 weeks, I drive Interstate 20 from the Shreveport area to Dallas, just so I could grocery shop at my favorite store, Trader Joe's. And on my way there, or way home, I'd pass the outskirts of Tyler. But that November 30th, a young gay man named Nicholas West, he had goals. Nicholas wanted to get laid. 23-year-old Nicholas borrowed his roommate's red truck that night. He drove to a park he visited often in Tyler, Bergfield Park. Bergfield Park was really the only area for gays as a meeting place in Tyler. The park's located in a residential section in downtown. It was kind of a cruise hangout. If someone gay was looking to meet someone, they'd cruise around the park in their car. If they wanted someone to stop and talk to them, they'd flash their headlights or they'd tap their brakes. As I mentioned, this wouldn't be Nicholas's first trip to the park. A 29-year-old man named Donald Aldrich, he visited the park often too, but he wasn't necessarily in search of a sexual encounter. Donald was looking for victims. The night of November 30th, Donald was joined by two teenagers, 19-year-old Henry Dunn and 17-year-old David McMillan. And I found myself wondering, why would an almost 30-year-old man hang out with teenagers? Well, it seemed that these three men were all CB enthusiasts. They met through talking over their CB radios. And I'm hoping you all know what a CB is. But for younger listeners who might not know, it's a radio-type gadget with a microphone. You can talk to other people who also have CB radios. Many big rig trucks come equipped with them. It was pretty popular back in the day before the internet became the way to socialize. Donald, who was also known as Sundance to his CB buddies, picked up Henry and David, and they went to Bergfield Park. They were going a-huntin'. Their prey? A gay man. Seeing Nicholas West at the park in his borrowed truck, Donald approached Nicholas and he flirted with him. He soon got into the truck with Nicholas, and the couple drove to a Montgomery Ward's department store parking lot. Nicholas and Donald were being followed by another car, Donald's car, that was being driven by Henry and David. At the parking lot, Henry and David got out of Donald's car. They walked up to the truck Nicholas and Donald were in, held a gun on Nicholas, and forced him out of the truck. In the parking lot, they took Nicholas's wallet and the truck keys. And then they made Nicholas walk to Donald's car where they shoved him inside. From this point, they drove Nicholas to a more remote and woodsy area of Tyler. It was actually a place called the Pits. The dirt at the Pits is red clay dirt. The three men started to hit and kick Nicholas. The CB gang pulled off Nicholas's shoes and his pants. And then one of them started to shoot Nicholas. Nicholas was shot 8 times. In his abdomen, arms, hands, and back. Nicholas, who was wet with his own blood and tears, was miraculously somehow alive. He lay face down on the red clay dirt, which was only getting redder. Tiny gurgling sounds could be heard coming from Nicholas until the last shot was fired into the back of his head. And this is where the CB gang left Nicholas face down on the clay. No pants, no shoes, his socks stained with the red clay. Nicholas was clad only in a shirt and his soiled underwear laying like a sleeping child. 2 days later, Nicholas's body was found. This wasn't the CB gang's first gay bashing and robbing. Other victims had survived these 3 men. But with Nicholas, the bashing had escalated to murder. The day after Nicholas's body was found, Henry Dunn was driving the truck Nicholas had borrowed around town like he owned it. He was pulled over and arrested. Shortly after that, the arrest of Donald Aldrich and David McMillan would follow. At his police interview, Donald almost seemed proud. Like he should be rewarded for cleaning the town of yet another gay. He also told the police he didn't like homosexuals because he was raped by a gay cousin when he was 9 years old. Donald was seen as the leader of the CB gang, maybe because he was a grown-ass man and the other 2 were teenagers. He was convicted and sentenced to death for first-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. Donald was executed in 2004. Henry Dunn, the 19-year-old, he was also convicted of the same 3 charges: murder, kidnapping, and robbery. And surprisingly to me, Henry was also sentenced to death. And the reason his surprised me so much is Henry was only 19 years old. That just seems kind of young, I guess. But also, warriors, Henry Dunn was the only black man of the group of 3. And I'll just drop that there for you to decide what you will with it. He was executed the year prior to Donald in 2003. David McMillan, the 17-year-old, he was seen as more of just a follower. He received a life prison term. It's kind of odd how judges in different jurisdictions operate. They're supposed to be fair and impartial in their rulings at all times. Yet my friends Jen and Cam at Our True Crime Podcast, they just covered a gay double murder that happened in Texas in 1988. An 18-year-old murderer went to trial. The prosecution thought they were being nice, asking for a life sentence instead of the death penalty. Texas Judge Jack Hampton gave the killer even less. He gave the killer 30 years. The killer served 19 years, and he's out now. And it's all because the victims were gay. The judge even went on to say to a reporter,
"The 2 guys that got killed wouldn't have been killed if they hadn't been cruising the street picking up teenage boys. I don't care for queers cruising the streets picking up teenage boys. I've got a teenage boy. I put prostitutes and gays at about the same level, and I'd be hard-pressed to give someone life for killing a prostitute. The victims were homosexuals. They were out in the homosexual area picking up teenage boys. Had they not been out there trying to spread their AIDS around, they'd still be alive today."
Really? Sounds to me like the dishonorable Judge Jack Hampton was declaring open season for gay bashing and sex worker killing. The level of ignorance of this man is just astounding. As well, the judge didn't even know the facts of the case he was overseeing, apparently. The victims he was speaking of were not trying to pick up teenagers. They weren't even trying to cruise men their age. They were there to smoke some fucking weed. And then the teenager that killed him is the one that found them, and he willfully put an end to their lives. Thankfully, Judge Jack Hampton wasn't proceeding over Nicholas's case in Tyler. And I'm equally as thankful Judge Jack Hampton is no longer a practicing judge. On January 27, 1994, 43-year-old Larry Leggett, who was a gay man, he worked at McDonald's in Irving, Texas, he was murdered in his home by someone who came in and stabbed him to death. When Larry didn't show up for his shift at McDonald's, Larry's family members went to his home. They had to break in because everything was securely locked. Larry's murder, along with the following 2 men I'm about to tell you about, was thought to be the result of a gay serial killer in the area. Paul Quintanilla, a 29-year-old man, had taken a 50-minute trip from his hometown of Ennis, Texas, to the gay bars of Irving. And this all happened in June of 1994. The following day, his naked body with his hands bound behind him was found in a field in Irving. Paul had blunt force trauma to his head, and he'd been stabbed at least a dozen times. Paul's throat and genitals were even cut. He, too, was the suspected victim of a possible gay serial killer. Larry David Allen's naked and multiple stab wound body was thrown out of a motel room window in August of '94. This also happened in Irving, Texas. He was one of the last men to be considered a victim of a possible gay serial killer in Irving. The man who was renting the motel room was named Edwin Perkins. He was from Kansas. And he was arrested for not just Larry David Allen's murder, but for the murder of Paul Quintanilla and Larry Leggett as well. 33-year-old Edwin Perkins was a bisexual man and a parolee who was still at large for a capital attempted murder charge and armed robbery. They were also looking at Edwin for the murder of a gay man in Gainesville, Texas, and for 2 gay murders in Dallas. But it seems like nothing came from the other ones that they were looking at him for. But check this out. Edwin was sentenced to life in prison. He's going to be eligible for parole in just 3 years, on September 1st, 2024. Life in prison is such a bullshit sentence. In Houston, a popular Aldine High School star quarterback who is now in college on a football scholarship, he was feeling kind of restless one night. Everyone who knew DeMarco McCollum thought he was going to eventually go all the way to the big leagues. They were sure he would play professional football. Unfortunately, 19-year-old DeMarco wasn't the guy that they thought he was. One July night in 1994, DeMarco was hanging out with 3 of his friends. They were all former high school teammates, Terrence Perro, DeCedric Gaines, and Chris Lewis. The 4 were considered the top football players at their school in 1993. But this July night, it was summer and they were bored. So they started to talk about the easiest way to earn money for some new school clothes. They decided they were going to take a ride to the Montrose section of Houston. And once they were there, they were going to find a gay guy to pick up, rob, and beat for fun and profit. Montrose is Houston's gay area. Most of the gay clubs and bars are there. It's the gayborhood. The 4 young men pulled up to a gay club and they waited for their perfect victim. An unsuspecting 29-year-old Michael Brzezinski had just exited one of the clubs. He was on his way to his car when the 4 young men jumped him. They grabbed him and they pushed him into their vehicle. They drove Michael to an isolated, undeveloped industrial park that was just a few miles away. Once there, they pulled him out of the car, took his car keys, and took his money. Michael, who normally never carried much cash around, was carrying $400 that night because he just cashed out his paycheck. The 4 bashers then proceeded to beat the shit out of Michael. Michael was on the ground, on his hands and knees, and DeMarco walked up behind him, put a pistol to the back of Michael's head, and pulled the trigger. DeMarco felt powerful at that moment, he told detectives. He felt like a judge. The 4 young men drove back to the club parking lot. They found Michael's car and they drove it to Dolly Wright Road, which appears to be not a very trafficked road, and maybe even less traffic in the middle of the night in 1994. The young men then lit Michael's car on fire and left. Both Michael's car and his body were discovered the following day. A little over 2 weeks later, a tip to Crime Stoppers had come in. The tipster had pointed the finger at DeMarco McCollum and his 3 friends, which makes me believe at least one of these guys had been running his mouth. DeMarco's 3 buddies were all sentenced to life terms for their part in killing Michael. But DeMarco, being the trigger man who shot and killed Michael, he received the death penalty. In 2011, DeMarco McCollum was lethally injected in the state of Texas. He was 30 years old at the time. To this day, Texas has no law banning gay or trans-panic offenses in its courtrooms. As well, there's no statewide anti-discrimination laws. Yes, a few of the bigger cities have some, but the whole state should be on board. Come on, Texas. You were almost a blue state in the last presidential election. And I know deep in the heart of Texas, you can protect your LGBTQ people better. Love you, Rainbow Warriors. And remember, it's not a crime to be gay, unless you're a murderer.